zooming way out, very introductory remarks here. Wildfires are a natural part of the Earth system for the last 400 million years. Since there have been plants on the surface of the planet, there have been wildfires. And so the natural occurrence of wildfires is generally ignited from lightning. You could get a wildfire started from hot lava, or maybe in an extreme case like a boulder falling down and causing a spark or something like that. But almost all of wildfires naturally are ignited by lightning, and so have been around for a very long time. And so, a lot of ecosystems have co-evolved with wildfires, and a lot of reproduction of various plants to actually require fires for their germination, things like that. So fires are natural. Human ancestors, about 1 million years ago, the evidence suggests we started using fire. And we now are by far the dominant cause of fires in the environment. So humans account for approximately 90% of fire ignitions globally now. So totally dominating lightning. And so this is a map of where fires occur annually, where this color here is showing you what percent of these pixels are burned every single year. So we see that fire is pretty prominent globally. So we have approximately 4% of the global land surface burns each year. And every 1,000 years, about 1/3 of the global land surface burns. So, the exceptions we see are, the ice sheets, we're not seeing burning. Very high latitudes, although we're seeing higher frequency of fires going further north recently. And then our, very, very arid deserts and the Tibetan Plateau, which is very arid and cold as well. But other than that, we have fires all over the place. And in particular, Africa has a lot of area burned. So the specific things I want to emphasize today are these 4 points. So these are our learning outcomes today. I want you to be able to list 4 ways in which humans affect wildfires. I want you to explain some of the reasons why California in particular has a environment that's conducive to large and dangerous wildfires, and how that's different from other areas around the world. I want you to make this connection between climate change and the increase in California wildfires that we've seen. So identify the long-term changes in California climate that are most responsible for the long-term increase in California wildfire activity. And then explain how fire suppression policies have inadvertently led to more extreme fires. So if you follow the news on this, you often kind of get this dichotomy about like, okay, we know that wildfires are increasing in California, and then some people really emphasize climate change and de-emphasize this idea of poor forest management, and other people do the exact opposite, really emphasize forest management and de-emphasize climate change. So we're going to talk about both, and you can kind of just tell from these class learning outcomes that the scientific literature on this suggests that there's a large contribution from both of these things. Okay, so the 4 ways in which humans affect wildfires, summarizing these things in this diagram. So I have over here people. This is like a flow chart of various ways that people can influence fire activity. And this is thinking about this kind of globally. So we'll zoom into California a little bit later, but globally, thinking about all the ways humans can influence fire activity. And I'll have this color coded, where red means that we're pretty sure that human caused changes in this pathway, this influence, have caused an increase in fire activity. Blue would mean human caused changes in this influence have likely caused a decrease in fire activity. So humans can cause increases or decreases. And then purple would be that it's uncertain. So ambiguous or unclear influence on fire activity. Okay, so you should be, kind of brainstorming like, what are the different ways that humans can influence fire activity? Okay, so one thing, I just mentioned that humans account for 90% of ignitions of fires globally now. So humans are lighting a lot of fires. So that can be from, things like fireworks. It can be from PG&Es down power lines. It can be from, campfires that aren't put out. It can be from sparks from automobile breakdowns, lawnmowers that hit a rock and cause a spark. So humans are igniting a lot of fires, most of the fires. Okay, humans also try to put out fires, right? So humans are affecting fires by trying to suppress them, and when they do occur, trying to put them out, right? That's what CAL FIRE does. So see, this is red, right? Humans are causing an increase. This is blue. Humans would cause a decrease via suppression. But when you suppress fires, you allow fuel, you allow more vegetation to build up because it's not being burned at kind of more frequent intervals. And so that's red. That can cause actually an increase in fire activity. It's kind of this backfire effect that if you suppress fires too much, then you build up fuel, and then when you do have a fire, you have a very bad fire with lots of fuel. Okay, land use. Humans have drastically altered the land. Humans have dramatically altered the land globally, mostly in the form of converting forests to agriculture. And so that's blue because agriculture, especially irrigated agriculture, does not burn, nearly as much as a wild ecosystem. And also urban areas, things like that, are not going to burn nearly as much as a forest. So changing land use globally has caused a decrease in fire activity. And then the one we talk about, humans are burning fossil fuels. So that releases CO2 into the atmosphere. CO2 fertilization is actually something that people look into, that we saw that can cause there to be an increase in biomass, which is fuel for fires. So that can actually increase fire activity, more fuel to burn. But increasing greenhouse gases increases the global temperature. Then that does a bunch of things to weather variables. So it might change ignitions via lightning. Right? So we have direct ignitions up here from people, like directly starting fires. But changing the global climate could change lightning patterns. I have this as purple. I would actually lean this towards red because the evidence seems to suggest that a warmer planet is a planet with more lightning over land. So there might be an increase in ignitions from the global climate changing. Wind, I also have as purple. So wind affects fires because fires need oxygen, right? So we think about that when we're trying to start like a campfire, that you can like blow on fire and it grows. So fires need oxygen. It's the same thing as the respiration equation. The combustion equation, which is like the fire equation, is basically the same thing as what we're doing with respiration. You're converting hydrocarbons, or you're using hydrocarbons as your fuel and oxygen, and you're releasing H2O and CO2. So wind also increases fire activity by pushing fires, moving them, right? So they can grow and be much bigger, more severe under windy conditions. Precipitation, I have purple also, because that kind of just depends on when and where. So this is thinking globally. So different locations, precipitation is going to affect fires differently. And even in California, it's kind of ambiguous. So we don't really expect there to be long-term changes in average precipitation in California. There might be a sharpening of the seasonality of precipitation, where we get more precipitation in the winter and less in the fall and spring. And so that would actually increase fire activity because you have a longer fire season. But the signals aren't totally clear on those things. And so these are all purple. So the main pathway that humans are affecting wildfire through climate change is this. It's through burning fossil fuels, increasing CO2, increasing global temperature. Over land, that essentially means, or most land locations, that means a drier land surface, so drier vegetation, and then that increases fire activity. So globally, when you look at all of the influences that people have on fires, we actually see that humans have caused a decrease in area burned globally, at least over the satellite record, and probably going back further from various estimates prior to the satellite record. And so this is a time series from 2003. This was a paper that came out in like 2017 or something, so it only goes up to 2015. But for example, this red line is area burned globally, and it starts at 1. Sorry, I cut that off. But point is, it's going down. And then this is a map of where the trends are up versus down. So upward trends are red and downward trends are blue. And so we see a lot of blue globally. So that's mostly due to this land use component, the humans changing the land towards agriculture that burns less, and then also intentionally suppressing fires. And so we see a lot of blue. So it's not a situation where globally the earth is turning into a fire over most of the land. Globally, we actually are seeing a decrease in area burned, but that is not the case here in California. So the rest of the time, I think people are most interested in what's going on in the U.S. West and in California. So I'm going to focus on that. So first, I'm going to talk about the reasons why California has an environment that is conducive to large and dangerous fires. So first, we kind of just have to think about like what ingredients you need for a fire. So here's a fire here. It has some fuel. With wildfires, that's vegetation, preferably dead vegetation, because that's going to be dry. You need something to ignite the fire, right? You need an ignition source, so either people or lightning. And then you need a climate that's conducive to wildfires, and climate and vegetation very much go hand in hand. Some locations, you have enough vegetation for fires, for wildfires, but the climate is too wet. So you want dry vegetation if you want fires. And I guess it's worth it to pause on that for a second. So we know intuitively that dry things burn easier than wet things. And the reason for that is just that heat prefers to evaporate water first before it starts combustion. So you can think about this like if you had a pot of soup on the stove, and soup with like a bunch of like very chunky soup. And if you turn on the burner, that's just let's say it's boiling. Like you're not in trouble for a long time, right? If you're just gonna turn on the burner, it's gonna boil, and your soup's just gonna boil. But if you wait like an hour or 2 hours and it boils off all of that water evaporates. Now you're gonna be in a situation where you could start a fire, because now you just have left over the food that's gonna be dry. And so it's just the way that it works is that heat first goes into evaporating water, and after the water is gone, then it goes into burning things. So if you have a log that's wet and you throw it in the fire, it's not going to burn right away. First, the fire evaporates the water, and then after that, it starts burning the log. And so that's why you want dry things for fires. So some climates are too wet for fires. Some climates are dry enough for fires, but they're so dry they don't have vegetation, right? You need moisture in order to grow vegetation. So both of these situations are not conducive to wildfires. There may also be very few ignitions here. This is probably the Sahara Desert. So a climate that would be very good for fires, if you want fires, would be someplace that's wet enough for vegetation, but dry enough for fires. And it turns out that California has exactly that type of situation. And it has a lot to do with our seasons with wet and dry. So I'm just gonna explain how that works a little bit here with this. Okay, so I like to start off looking at Africa here, because it has this very distinct pattern where it's green in the middle, and it's tan to the north, and it's tan to the south. And so what that is showing is, so the equator is right around here. And we have something in the climate system called the intertropical convergence zone. And all that means is that there are these, so the equator is where the sun's energy is most intense. And so you get a lot of heating right at the equator, and you get evaporation and the movement of water up into the atmosphere, where it forms clouds. So cloud, anvil cloud. And so then that draws in moisture from, these end up being called trade winds from the ocean, and it rains out. Here's my rain. And so that causes this area near the equator to be wet enough for a lot of vegetation, right? So this is a rainforest in the Congo area. And so that rising air, what goes up must come down. So you have rising air here that cools and causes rain and causes this area to be moist. But then it comes down at these subtropical latitudes, we call that. And those are where air is subsiding, where it's coming down. That suppresses rain. It makes it so that it's very difficult for rainstorms to come about. It makes the atmosphere, you can kind of just think of it as like the sinking air kind of puts a cap on the atmosphere. And so there's not going to be rain and thunderstorms there. So this is like the broad picture that we see actually all around the world. And so I start here in Africa just because you can see it really obviously with the geography from the satellite. So the deserts on both sides of the equatorial rainforest region. But if I rotate this over and look at what's going on at our continents, we see roughly the same thing over here. So it's not as clear just because of the orientation of the land surfaces. But we see that California is kind of right on the border of this area that would be very dry. And what ends up happening is that the seasons affect where this driest area is. So if we go back over here, in the Northern Hemisphere, summer, the Earth is tilted a little bit more towards the sun. This whole thing shifts north. And then in the Northern Hemisphere, winter, the whole thing shifts south. And so the same thing is going on over here, that in our summer, this dry area shifts north over us. Then in our winter, it shifts south. And so then we get the moisture that is for our forests to build up. So we have dry in the summer because we're under this area of subsiding air, that means sinking air, and then wet in the winter because that whole thing is moving south, and then storms can come in. So we can see that with actual data here, that this is an animation of average rainfall throughout the year. So these are just going through the months of the year, April, May, June, July, August. And so you can see what I was just talking about, that this area here is that area near the equator where you have the most rainfall. And then it just shifts north and south throughout the year. And if you look at us here, I have my cursor right where we are, that we are sometimes right in the middle of that area with no rain. That's in our summer. And then in our winter, we are in an area with rain because that whole kind of dry zone shifted to the south. So the point of that is that that results in this situation of wet enough for vegetation. We get our winter rains so we can build up forests, but then dry in the summer so that forests can burn. And this is just a demonstration of that with data that we have a fire season. So this is the month of the year and the average monthly acres burned and average monthly fires. We see not a lot in January, February, March. Then we go a little bit up in April, May, June. So we have July, August, September, June. Those are the times of year when we have the most fires. And that's because it's the time of year when we're in that dry zone where fires can be most conducive to fires. Okay, so that's the base state of California fires, why California in particular is conducive to fires. And now I want to talk about climate change related to California fires. So first, this is saying climate change affecting the increase in California fires. So first, just showing you the increase in California fires. This is a record from CAL FIRE that goes back to 1987. And this is the acres burned in the state, California annual area burned. This is the famous 2020 that was just record shattering, at least in terms of this record going back to 1987. But so we see this long-term increase, and it's a big increase, right? It's not like it's gone up a few percent. We're talking about doubling, tripling the kind of average area burned. So increases, that's just to say that it is absolutely true that we've seen a long-term increase in the area of the state that's burned. And just to give you an idea of like what this is in terms of like the fraction of the state. So this is 4.5 million acres is like 4% of the state in 2020. Okay, so fires are increasing. The global average temperature has increased by 1.3 degrees Celsius. And if you look in California, we have Celsius over here, it's a little bit more than that. So if we say it was like 14 degrees Celsius in the 1920s, it's closer to 15.5 or 16 degrees Celsius now. So pretty similar. You can kind of extrapolate what's happened globally to the local in most locations because it's global warming. We've seen those maps of it being pretty uniform. But so that's just to say that California has warmed just as the globe has. And so what does that mean in terms of our connection between climate change and California fires? So like one way to think about like how can climate change, what are the conditions that could affect how California fires have changed? One way to think about that is to think about these things called red flag warnings, which are what the National Weather Service issues when there's a particularly dangerous fire situation. And so this is a graph used by the National Weather Service to inform when they release red flag warnings. And so they have this like combination of different variables. So let's just read this. So it says, the matrix below assumes 10-hour fuel moisture of less than 6%. So that just means that vegetation is dry. So it assumes vegetation is dry. It assumes that there hasn't been rain in the past 24 hours. And then it's looking at two variables and saying, if both of these conditions are met, then we should issue a red flag warning. which tells people to be extra careful about fires and making sure that they're not doing any activities that would cause sparks, things like that. So over here we have relative humidity. So that is one of the variables we see on our apps for the weather and everything. And so that's a measure of moisture, right? How humid is it is how moist it is. And so we see that we have decreasing relative humidity going down here. So they make this distinction between daytime minimum and nighttime maximum. But that's not important. What's important here is just that you're more likely to get a red flag warning when it's dry, so low relative humidity. Then over here we have a wind. So you're more likely to get a red flag warning when it's windier. So if you have relatively high relative humidity, then you need a lot of wind to get a red flag warning. And if you have relatively low wind, then you need it to be very dry to get a red flag warning. But you can just see how these variables interact. That's giving us an indication of what type of environmental variables would need to change climatologically in order for the climate to be more conducive to wildfires. And the other variable that is not necessarily represented here is temperature. So shorthand for fire weather conditions is often the phrase that's used is hot, dry, windy. So we see dry and windy on this chart, and then the other thing is hot, is temperature. So we again can kind of see this, like this is relatively obvious just from looking at the seasonal cycle that these things are what affect wildfire activity, right? So the reason that we have a fire season in June, July, August is because that's when it's hot and dry. It's actually not windier in July and August. Those are actually our least windy months. And so that kind of gives you an indication that maybe hot and dry is some of the most important climatological reasons why fire activity varies. So let's look at the kind of long-term trends in these things. So here's, again, just putting up the same graph before, demonstrating that we have a long-term trend in area burned. And so if we're going to want to connect climate change, if we think that there's an influence of climate change on this long-term trend in California fires, then you should have a long-term trend in some of these variables as well. So that's the question I'm asking here is, are there long-term trends in these components of fire weather? Is it getting hotter, drier, windier? Well, I already showed you the plot of California temperature. California temperature is getting hotter. So I'm putting a check mark here that it's getting hotter. And just some more details on this graph here. This is observations of California temperature over the summer season. So that's in black. And then this red line here is climate models. So climate models run in the past to see if they kind of reproduce observations and then what we expect in the future. And by the way, unfortunately, this increase in the future is kind of locked in regardless of climate policy. So when we look at different emission scenarios, different, whether or not the Paris Agreement is met or completely disregarded, those changes in temperature don't really diverge until 2050, 2060, 2070. And so this trajectory is what we're on kind of no matter what climate policy is passed. So it's going to get warmer in the next couple decades, no matter what. And then dryness is a similar story. So we saw in that red flag warning matrix that aridity dryness in terms of relative humidity, this is a different measure, but it's the same idea, that's gonna be more conducive to wildfires when it's drier. And we have a similar situation. It's been getting drier and drier since the 1980s over the same time period when wildfire activity has increased, and we're only expecting it to get continuously drier over the next couple of decades. And then wind, so this gets to the question about why wind was purple in that diagram. Again, it's not saying the wind doesn't affect fires. Wind certainly affects fires. Windier conditions cause there to be more fire movement and causes fire activity to be more severe. But I have an X here for whether or not the winds are changing in such a way that it would cause an increase in California fires. And so this is a graph that kind of exemplifies that from a particular study looking at Santa Ana winds in Southern California. So Santa Ana winds are these offshore dry winds that drive a lot of major fires in Southern California. And we have the Diablo winds in Northern California. And I'm actually on a project right now looking at changes in Diablo winds. And we see a similar story with Diablo winds as we see with Santa Ana winds, which is we do not really see changes in those things historically. And yeah, so this is what I'm trying to show here is that there's not really an upward trend in Santa Ana winds, and if it's just kind of flat. And here's actually a couple of maps from the most recent California Climate Change Assessment Report. And these Maps over here are percent changes in wind speed in the years, basically the last part of this century. So this is from projections from climate models. And these blue colors mean decreases in wind speed. So our best estimates are decreases in wind speed in the future. So that's going to be something that's not going to be, that's, if anything, it decreases fire activity. So I have a check mark next to hot, a check mark next to dry, and an X next to windy, meaning that we're seeing an increase in temperature, an increase in aridity, an increase in dryness, but not an increase in windiness, and if anything, a decrease in windiness. So the climatological drivers of increased fire activity would come from these two components. And so I will at some point revisit that actually hot and dry are kind of the same thing for California anyway, but for now we can kind of just think of them separately. But so both of those things are increasing, and so those are our main conditions that are changing, that are causing California to be more conducive to wildfires in the long run. So these are the long-term changes in California climate that are most responsible for the long-term increase in California wildfire activity from a climate change perspective. Okay, so then there's this other thing going on, the fire suppression policies. So one thing that's interesting to think about is like, so this record of California annual area burned just goes back to 1987, because that's when CAL FIRE started to meticulously keep track of these things. And there's different, you'll see different graphs that go back further and have different estimates. But when people kind of look at the evidence going back even further, one at least prominent estimate was that prior to 1800, what we saw in 2020, which was 4.5 million acres burned, that may have basically occurred every single year. So what it seems like is that we're actually starting from a very low, an artificially low starting point from fires in the 1980s. And now they're increasing back to kind of an amount of area burned that we used to see every single year. So it's not necessarily unprecedented, but the severity of these things, the severity of the fires now may be unprecedented. So this is going back up to this pathway here of people intentionally suppressing fires, then that causing this fuel buildup, which then causes very bad fires, very intense, more dangerous, hard to deal with fires when they do occur. So first, just like here's a little bit more evidence of the suppression of fires, that you can kind of see this visually in like cross sections of trees, where we know like the tree rings are the years, and so you can, if you take a cross section of a tree, you can count backwards in time. So this one was cut down in 1999, and then you can count back and say, okay, here's 1908. And if you look at, so this goes all the way back to 1783. And if you look at this left side here, what we see are these burn scars. So the tree is also recording when it experienced a major fire. And so those are labeled here as well. And you can see like there was, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So 10 fires over this period of time. So every decade to a couple decades, there was a fire experienced by this tree. And obviously the fire is not too severe that it didn't kill the tree, because the tree's still there, available to record the next fire. And so this was kind of the condition that it was in. And so we think that this is what would happen kind of naturally, even without people, but it was also the indigenous people of California that intentionally burned the landscape and had less severe fires over this time period that were more frequent. And then in 1900, the US Forest Service kind of takes over and says no more fires. And so now we don't see any burn scars over this time period. And so the tree is just growing and not recording any fires. And so that has negative implications for fires when they do start. And so we can kind of see that with this graphic, that this is the situation before, with either the way that indigenous people manage the land or the way that it would be naturally. So forests without artificial fire suppression and or intentional burning or thinning. So like if you intentionally light fires during times of the year when it's wetter, so the fire won't get out of control, and you can essentially get rid of all of this fuel that would build up in between the large trees. So this is what it looks like. Relatively thin forest. You have a fire that kind of stays on the ground. it might affect the tree a little bit. The tree might get a burn scar, but the trees are fine. The forest is healthy and survives the fire. And again, I mentioned that since these ecosystems co-evolved with natural fires, a lot of their reproduction and things like that actually rely on there being fires. And then this is the situation that we're in now. That since 1900, when we've had this policy of artificially suppressing fires when they happen, so putting them out right away, that has allowed there to be much more fuel built up. So you have much more of these kind of smaller trees and brush in between the larger trees. And so then when a fire does occur, there's way more fuel for it to burn, and the fire can be way hotter and more intense, and it can be so bad that it actually kills all of the big trees, and so it can completely wipe out a forest. And so we have this situation where it's getting hotter, it's getting drier. It's not necessarily getting windier, but it's getting hotter and drier, and we've had this century of fire suppression that has caused there to be way more fuels to burn. So we have way more dry fuels available. And it's difficult to assess which exactly is more important for our long-term increase in fire activity. But it seems like it's probably around half, like half and half. When you look at kind of the statistics of it, and you look at, there's ways of getting at, how much does aridity explain changes in area burn from year to year. You can look at that statistically, and we see that about 40% of the variability in area burn from year to year can be explained by variability in how dry it is. And so that leaves 60% for other things. And so other things can be randomness in terms of ignitions. So whether or not there's a lightning storm that causes ignitions like there was in 2020, or whether or not there was a gender reveal party in the right place that caused a large fire. So that kind of randomness is not going to be explained by the variability in dryness. But then we do think a lot of the long-term trend is attributable to this just increase in fuels. So it's kind of like, the story is kind of like this, is that this is going back further than the other graph that was just for California. This is for the entire Western United States, and it's looking at area burns. So this goes back to 1920. So we see that there was a long-term downward trend in area burned from the 1910s to the middle of the century. So this was kind of the time period when suppression was working, when we're putting out fires and we were getting less and less fires every year. And now we're in this situation where they actually have on here, this blue is suppression costs. So every year we're putting more and more money into fire suppression still. We're still trying to put out fires when they start, but it's not working anymore. We can't control it. So we've still built up all this fuel. It's getting hotter and drier on top of that. And so we're seeing this long-term increase in area burned. And so far our suppression efforts have not worked. And so it seems like, we really, and we're moving towards this policy-wise, that we need a lot of mechanical thinning or prescribed burns, similar to the way that indigenous people did it before colonization, in order to thin out these forests, to get rid of these fuels. And that's the only way to solve this in the near term. Obviously, climate policy in the long term is going to be very important, but I was hinting at this here, that climate policy is not going to help in the next couple decades. Climate policy is going to help later in the century. But if we want to deal with this problem, or if we want to see results sooner than that, then it has to be policy around treating forests in the near term. So that's my last thing there about fire suppression policies backfiring and inadvertently leading to more extreme fires when they do occur.